an ant can defeat an elephant if it chooses the right battlefield. The old man leaned forward as he said it, eyes tired but burning with conviction. Outside, the jungle hummed with the sounds of a country at war. Inside, in a dimly lit room, somewhere in the North Vietnamese countryside, a small group of revolutionaries hung on his every word. He was short, frail, and unassuming. His beard was thin, his clothes simple. If you passed him on the street, you might mistake him for a schoolteacher or a village elder. But this man had already helped bring one empire to its knees. He was in the middle of defeating a second. And before his story ended, he would challenge a third, the most powerful superpower on Earth. His name was Ho Chi Minh. And this is the story of how a poor boy from a small village in French Indochina became the man who outlived and outmaneuvered three empires, France, Japan, and the United States, and changed the fate of the 20th century. Ho Chi Minh was not born Ho Chi Minh. In May of 1890, in a small village called Kim Lien, in central Vietnam's Nghệ An province, a baby boy was born into a family that had very little except pride. The region had a reputation, poor, stubborn, and fiercely resistant to outsiders. Nghệ An was the kind of place where people remembered old insults for generations. And the Vietnamese people had many old insults to remember. For over 1,000 years, Vietnam had lived under Chinese domination. Then, after brief independence and internal dynasties, it fell under the rising shadow of a new power, France. By the late 19th century, the red, white, and blue of the French tricolor flew over what they called Indochine Française, French Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. For the people living there, the polite term protectorate translated into harsh realities: land confiscations, heavy taxes, forced labor, racial hierarchy, and a school system that taught that French civilization was the peak of human achievement, and that the locals should be grateful just to stand in its shadow. Into this tension, humiliation, pride, and the first sparks of modern nationalism, Nguyen Sinh Cung was born. That was his original name. His father, Nguyen Sinh Sac, was a Confucian scholar, steeped in classical texts and poetry. He had passed imperial exams, risen to a small official post, and then lost it. Why? Because he had beaten a corrupt local official for exploiting the poor. In a system built on hierarchy and obedience, that kind of justice could not be tolerated. He was dismissed. You can imagine what that looked like to a young boy, a father who did everything right, studied, passed the exams, served the state, and was punished for defending the powerless. From early on, the young Nguyen absorbed two lessons: that injustice was real, and that the existing order would not fix itself. He also gained something else from his father: a love of classical learning, Vietnamese literature, and pride in the country's independent past, in the long struggle against Chinese rule, against invaders from the north and south. At age 10, he was renamed Nguyen Tat Thanh, Nguyen the Accomplished. Nobody then suspected just how prophetic that name would become. But for now, he was just another colonial subject, in a land that was not fully his own. To understand why this boy would one day challenge three empires, we need to understand the world he was born into. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, European empires stretched across the globe: Britain in India and Africa, France in Indochina and North Africa, the Dutch in Indonesia, Belgium in the Congo. On maps in European classrooms, large swaths of the world were colored to match European flags, as if these places were mere extensions of Paris or London. France saw Indochina as a treasure chest and a proving ground. Rice, rubber, coal, and cheap labor made it profitable. The idea of a civilizing mission made it palatable to French consciences back home. But for Vietnamese peasants, civilization looked like losing your land to plantations. It meant being forced to grow crops for export while your own family struggled to eat. It meant being called Annamite in a tone that meant something closer to native or inferior than fellow citizen. Resistance simmered. There were traditional uprisings, royalists who wanted to restore their emperor's power and push out the French. There were millenarian movements, religious rebellions, promising a coming age of justice. There were also modern nationalists, inspired by Japan's victory over Russia in 1905, which showed that an Asian nation could defeat a European great power. Young intellectuals traveled abroad, read new political theories, brought them back in secret. Some turned to republicanism, others to socialism, some to anarchism. Into this world stepped Nguyen Ta Thanh. He watched, listened, and learned. But he didn't just want to study resistance. He wanted to understand the people who ruled his country from the inside. In 1911, a young Vietnamese man appeared at the port city of Saigon. He was slim, dark-haired, and determined. He had a modest education, knew some French, and carried the heavy awareness that his country was not its own master. He walked up to a French steamship, the Amiral Latouche-Treville, and offered to work as a kitchen assistant. According to later stories, he asked the captain, "Can you show me France?" Whether or not those exact words were spoken, one thing is clear. He wanted to see the world of the colonizers firsthand. He signed on under a new name, Nguyen Van Ba. It was the first of many names he would use in his life. As the ship left Saigon and cut across the oceans, Nguyen was leaving more than a port behind. He was leaving the boundaries that colonial society had assigned to him: plantation worker, clerk, or minor functionary. He was going to see how the empire really worked. The ship took him to ports in Africa, to maybe Madagascar, then to Europe. He later claimed he set foot in Marseille, in London, even possibly in New York and Boston at different points in his journeys. Separation between memory, myth, and political storytelling blur here. But we know this: he traveled widely, observed deeply, and rarely wasted time. In France, he saw both splendor and poverty. The shining boulevards of Paris, the cafes, the literature, and the cramped apartments of workers, the factories, the strikes, the harsh police crackdowns. He saw that the same republic that preached liberty, equality, fraternity presided over an empire where liberty was denied, equality was scoffed at, and fraternity stopped at the color line. He took odd jobs: a kitchen helper, a photographer's assistant, a cleaner. He spent long hours in workers' neighborhoods, talking with socialists, trade unionists, and anti-colonial activists from other parts of the world. He was not yet Ho Chi Minh, the revolutionary leader. He was just a quiet, intense young man from an obscure colony, trying to find a weapon that could break an empire. World War I changed everything. From 1914 to 1918, Europe tore itself apart. Great powers that had once seemed invincible slaughtered each other in trenches stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland. France, like other empires, called upon its colonial subjects, and they came, sometimes willingly, often not. Vietnamese soldiers fought and died in French uniforms. Vietnamese laborers dug trenches, hauled supplies, and worked in munitions factories in Europe. Their lives were spent to defend a country whose name many of them had only read in school books. For men like Nguyen, the hypocrisy was glaring. When the war ended, millions were dead. Empires had fallen: the Russian, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and German. And yet, in the colonies, the flags did not change. But there was a moment, a brief, shining moment, when it seemed like they might. In 1919, the victors gathered in Paris to redraw the map of the world and write the Treaty of Versailles. Among the many voices pleading for a new order was that of a small, almost anonymous man, working as a kitchen assistant and handyman in Paris. He wrote a petition titled "The Claims of the Annamite People." Annam was the French term for Central Vietnam. In practice, it stood for the Vietnamese as a whole. The petition did not demand independence. Instead, it made 8 modest requests: representation for Vietnamese in the French Parliament, legal equality between French and natives, freedom of press and association, an end to forced labor, and educational reforms. The man who drafted and delivered this document signed it with a new name: Nguyen Ai Quoc, Nguyen the Patriot. He tried multiple times to personally deliver the petition to the American president, Woodrow Wilson, who had been speaking loudly about the right of nations to self-determination. But Wilson never received him. The great men at Versailles did not recognize the skinny kitchen helper from Indochina. The petition was ignored. Nothing changed. For Nguyen Ai Quoc, this was a turning point. He had appealed to the conscience of liberal democracy and found that it did not hear him. If the empire would not listen to polite petitions, he would have to find another language: the language of revolution. Paris in the early 1920s was a laboratory of ideas. In smoky cafes and cramped meeting rooms, exiles and dreamers argued over the future. Socialists, communists, anarchists, trade unionists, pacifists. Nguyen Ai Quoc gravitated toward these circles. He began writing articles under that name, exposing the abuses of French rule in Indochina, smuggling his words back home to be read in secret. His reports were sharp, detailed, and unsparing. He described peasants whipped for missing tax quotas, villages burned for resisting forced rice deliveries, coolies dying in rubber plantations. He did not write like an academic. He wrote like someone who had already chosen a side. In 1920, something caught his attention: news from Russia. 3 years earlier, in 1917, the Bolsheviks had overthrown the Russian monarchy and claimed they were building a new kind of state, a workers' state. They had called for the overthrow of imperialism and the liberation of colonized peoples worldwide. In 1920, at the Congress of the French Socialist Party in Tours, the party split over whether to join the new Communist International, the Comintern, based in Moscow. Nguyen attended that Congress. In the end, the left wing broke away and formed the French Communist Party. Nguyen joined them. He later said that when he read Lenin's writings on national and colonial questions, he felt like a hungry man seeing bread. Lenin's argument was simple but radical. The fight against colonialism was not a side issue, but central to the global struggle. The oppressed of Asia, Africa, and Latin America could be allies of the working class in Europe and Russia, and together they could shake the old order. Here was something new, a powerful European movement that did not just want to reform empire, but to destroy it. Nguyen took that hope seriously. In 1923, he traveled to Moscow, then to other parts of the communist world, not as a Western-educated liberal, but as a chosen representative of the colonized. He studied at the Communist University of the Toilers of the East, absorbed strategy, doctrine, and tactics, and built contacts with other activists from colonized countries: Indians, Chinese, Indonesians, Africans. But he was not a simple puppet. He saw communism as a tool, an ideology and network he could use for Vietnam's liberation. His revolution would be Marxist, yes, but it would also be deeply Vietnamese. By the mid-1920s, he moved again to Asia. This time to the bustling port city of Guangzhou, Canton, in southern China, a hub of revolutionary activity after the fall of the Qing dynasty, and during the shakeup of warlords and nationalists. There, under yet another name, Li Thuy, he began training Vietnamese youth in political theory and guerrilla organizing. He helped found the Revolutionary Youth League, a precursor to a more formal communist party. His students were the sons of peasants, small clerks, disillusioned former mandarins, the raw material of a new elite. He gave them something the old imperial order never had: a story of the future in which Vietnam was free of foreign control and governed by its own people. Then, in 1930, in Hong Kong, he helped unify several fragmented groups into a single organization, the Communist Party of Vietnam, soon rebranded under Comintern pressure as the Indochinese Communist Party. This was his most important achievement before he even set foot again in Vietnam as a leader. He had built the skeleton of a political machine that would, in time, become the spine of a new state. But that victory came at a cost. For the next decade, he often had to lead from afar, because the French colonial authorities knew exactly who he was now. They might not have caught him yet, but they knew that somewhere out there was a man named Nguyen Ai Quoc, a dangerous agitator. Wanted posters with his face circulated. His own name had become a weapon and a target. As the 1930s unfolded, the world slid toward another catastrophe. The Great Depression shattered economies. Fascism rose in Italy and Germany. Japan, hungry for resources and empire, expanded aggressively into Manchuria and China. In Indochina, famine and economic hardship deepened Vietnamese resentment. The French cracked down on any hint of dissent, and that included the communists. Many of Ho's comrades were jailed, executed, or forced into hiding. Ho himself disappeared from public record for stretches of time. He was likely in the Soviet Union, sometimes in China, sometimes dodging both colonial police and internal communist purges. He survived where many did not. Then, in 1939, the European powder keg exploded again. World War II had begun. In 1940, France fell to Nazi Germany in a shockingly short campaign. The proud republic was humiliated, its government, now based in Vichy, collaborating with the occupiers. Far away, in Southeast Asia, this created a power vacuum and an opportunity. Japan, now aligned with Germany, looked south. It wanted bases, raw materials, and access to the Pacific. French Indochina was suddenly very vulnerable. In September 1940, Japanese troops marched into northern Vietnam. At first, they did not push the French completely out. Instead, a strange dual rule emerged. Vichy France technically remained the colonial administrator. Japanese forces occupied the territory and dictated strategic decisions, but they let French officials run the day-to-day colonial apparatus. For ordinary Vietnamese, this meant one thing. They now had not one overlord, but two. French officials collected their taxes, enforced their laws. Japanese officers requisitioned rice, animals, and labor for their war machine. This crushing pressure led to one of the most horrifying episodes in Vietnam's modern history: the famine of 1944 to 45, particularly in the north. Floods and poor harvests played a role, but the real disaster came from policy. Both Japanese and French authorities demanded rice for export and for the army, even as people starved. Local storage systems were disrupted. Rail lines prioritized troops and supplies, and hoarding increased. As many as 1 to 2 million Vietnamese died of hunger. Villages wasted away. People lined the roads, skeletal, begging for a handful of grain. In some areas, parents abandoned children at temples, hoping someone, anyone, would feed them. In this hellish landscape, one group of Vietnamese offered something almost no one else did: food and the promise of revenge. They called themselves the Viet Minh, the League for the Independence of Vietnam. Behind them, guiding strategy, lay an old revolutionary now using the name that would become famous, Ho Chi Minh. Ho, from a common Vietnamese surname he had used before in China. Chi Minh, meaning he who is enlightened, or bringer of light. It was a confident name, perhaps even grandiose, but by now he had earned it. In 1941, after decades abroad, Ho Chi Minh finally returned to his homeland, though not openly. He slipped across the border from China into a remote mountainous region of northern Vietnam near the village of Pac Bo. There, in a limestone cave, he set up a modest base, a bamboo table, a stone as a chair, a small stream, which he jokingly named the Karl Marx Stream. He wrote, met messengers, and planned. From this hidden headquarters, the Viet Minh began to knit together a network of guerrilla bases, local committees, and underground cells in villages and towns. Their message was simple and powerful. Independence, not reform, not better colonial management. Full Vietnamese independence from foreign rule. They were communists at the core, but Ho was pragmatic. The Viet Minh presented themselves as a broad nationalist front. Liberals, peasants, small businessmen, even some religious leaders could fit under this umbrella. They organized raids on grain warehouses and distributed rice to starving villagers, for many, the first concrete experience of the resistance. They formed small armed units, hit collaborators and isolated Japanese posts, and then melted back into the mountains and forests. They cultivated discipline. Do not steal from the people, do not abuse them, pay fairly when you can, explain your cause. They worked hard to be seen as protectors, not predators. This is one of the keys to understanding Ho Chi Minh's success. He was never just a theorist. He knew that political legitimacy in a poor, rural country came from something very tangible. Who fed you when you were starving? Who buried your dead? Who defended your village? While Ho and his fighters expanded their reach, the larger war turned against Japan. By 1945, American planes were bombing Japanese positions across Southeast Asia. Japanese forces, increasingly desperate, tightened their grip, and then did something unexpected. In March 1945, the Japanese staged a coup d'etat in Indochina. They disarmed the French colonial troops, interned French officials, and took direct control. It was, in one sense, the final humiliation of the French Empire in Indochina. It had been unable to defend itself and its colony. Japan tried to stamp a friendly label on this takeover. They encouraged the Vietnamese Emperor, Bao Jai, to proclaim the end of French rule and the independence of Vietnam, under Japanese protection, of course. But for many Vietnamese, this rang hollow. Independence under a foreign army's shadow was not the real thing, and indeed, Japanese control remained absolute. Yet something had cracked. The illusion that France would last forever in Vietnam had been shattered. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, after the devastating atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Soviet entry into the war, their troops in Indochina were suddenly leaderless. The French were still disarmed and scattered. The Allied forces, including the British and Chinese, were not yet in place. For the first time in decades, no foreign power fully controlled the streets of Hanoi and Saigon. Into that vacuum stepped Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh. They called it the August Revolution. Across urban centers and rural districts, Viet Minh cadres moved quickly. In Hanoi, they rallied crowds, armed supporters, and surrounded key government buildings. Imperial flags came down. New red flags with a yellow star went up. In Saigon and Hue, similar actions unfolded, sometimes more chaotically, with clashes between rival groups. but the dominant force in the north was clearly the Viet Minh. On August 19, 1945, the Viet Minh seized control in Hanoi. Within days, they had moved to effectively control much of northern and central Vietnam, though their hold in the south was more contested. Emperor Bao Jai, faced with a fait accompli and likely seeing little alternative, made a decision that would echo through history. He abdicated. He renounced his throne and handed his imperial seal and sword to representatives of the new revolutionary government. In symbolic terms, it was powerful. The old monarchy, once intertwined with foreign domination, had stepped aside. A new force claimed to represent the nation. On September 2, 1945, in Hanoi's Ba Jin Square, Ho Chi Minh stepped up to a wooden podium in front of a crowd of hundreds of thousands. He was thin, in a simple khaki suit. His beard was wispy. He did not look like the kind of man who toppled empires. He began to speak. But before he quoted Marx or Lenin, he did something very different. He read, in Vietnamese, the opening words of the American Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He then went on to declare, Vietnam has the right to be a free and independent country. And in fact, it is so already. It was a masterstroke of political theater. In one move, Ho grounded his revolution not just in communist ideology, but in the very language of Western liberalism. He was saying, you taught the world these principles, we are merely applying them. Thus was born the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. But as the cheering crowds went home, something else was happening. In distant rooms in Paris, London, and Washington, the diplomats and generals of the great powers were drawing lines on maps once again. And their plans did not include Ho Chi Minh as the undisputed master of all Vietnam. On paper, World War II had ended with talk of freedom and self-determination. In reality, the old empires were not ready to let go. France, now freed from Nazi occupation and trying to restore its prestige, was determined to reclaim Indochina. French leaders spoke about federation, reform, autonomy, but independence? Not yet. The Allies decided that different forces would temporarily occupy Vietnam to accept the Japanese surrender. Chinese nationalist troops in the north, British troops in the south. In the south, the British quickly allowed French forces to return and rearm, and even used Japanese former soldiers to help them restore control. Clashes erupted between the Viet Minh and returning French authorities in Saigon. The seeds of a new war were sown almost immediately. In the north, the situation was more complex. Chinese nationalist troops, corrupt and poorly supplied, looted and extorted the population. Ho Chi Minh's government tried to coexist, buying time, even making some concessions, such as allowing anti-communist parties some space. Ho's strategy in these months was cautious but determined. He knew that the Viet Minh were not yet strong enough to defeat a full French military return. He also knew that the global balance of forces was changing. The Cold War was beginning. The United States and Soviet Union were emerging as rival superpowers, and colonialism was under new ideological pressure. So, in early 1946, he agreed to negotiations with the French. The result was the Fontainebleau talks and the March 6th Agreement. France would recognize the Democratic Republic of Vietnam as a free state within a French union, and in return, Viet Minh would allow some French troops to return temporarily to the north to replace the Chinese. It was a compromise, and perhaps, from Ho's perspective, a temporary retreat. He was betting that if he could gain time to consolidate power, build an army, and rally international sympathy, he could negotiate from a stronger position later. But colonial systems rarely loosen their grip willingly. On the ground, small incidents, clashes between French and Vietnamese forces, disagreements over administration, mutual distrust piled up like dry tinder. Then, in November 1946, a dispute in the port city of Haiphong escalated into open violence. French naval bombardment killed thousands of Vietnamese civilians. The fragile trust broke. On the night of December 19, 1946, Hanoi plunged into darkness as power was cut. Viet Minh forces launched coordinated attacks against French positions. Ho Chi Minh issued a call to arms, rather die than be enslaved. The First Indochina War had begun. It would last nearly 8 years, and it would end with the first great empire on Ho Chi Minh's path brought to its knees. For the French, this was meant to be a police action, a restoration of order in a wayward colony. But the war that unfolded was something very different. Ho Chi Minh and his military strategist, Vo Nguyen Giap, understood that they could not defeat France in conventional terms, tank for tank or plane for plane. So they chose a different battlefield: time, terrain, and national will. In the early years, Viet Minh forces were lightly armed guerrillas, living in jungle bases, striking quickly and retreating. Villagers hid weapons and supplied food. Spies infiltrated cities, gathering information. French troops found themselves fighting an enemy who seemed to vanish into forests and rice paddies. Still, France committed serious resources. Foreign legion units, African colonial troops, North African soldiers, and French regulars poured into Indochina. French commanders built fortified posts, launched sweeping operations, and tried to entice local elites to join non-communist autonomous governments. Both sides committed brutalities. French forces, frustrated by invisible enemies, often struck back harshly. Village burnings, torture in prisons, summary executions of suspected Viet Minh. The Viet Minh assassinated rivals, carried out political purges, and executed those labeled traitors or spies. This was not a clean war of lines on a map. It was intimate, up close, and often neighbor against neighbor. As the 1950s began, something shifted. The communists in China, led by Mao Zedong, had won their civil war in 1949 and established the People's Republic of China. For Ho Chi Minh, this was enormous. He now had a massive ally sharing a border with his northern strongholds, one that was ideologically aligned and willing to send arms, equipment, and advisors. The Soviet Union also increased its involvement, though more from a distance. Now, Viet Minh troops began to transform from ragged guerrillas into more structured regular units, capable of larger battles. France, too, felt the new global context. The United States, gripped by anti-communist fear, began financing a growing share of the French war effort. What had started as a colonial war was now tied to the early Cold War. Vietnam was becoming a pawn on a larger chessboard. But for people on the ground, it was still about something more basic: who ruled their land. Ho Chi Minh himself, during much of this war, was not directing each battle. He was a political leader, a symbol, a strategist. He moved between jungle headquarters, dodging French patrols, living relatively modestly, writing poetry, issuing appeals, and trying to balance competing pressures: radical land reformers within his party, moderate nationalists, and the demands of his foreign backers. He was part Lenin, part village elder. He cultivated an image of simplicity and accessibility. Photographs from the time show him sitting with peasants, talking with soldiers, living in sparse conditions. Was this entirely authentic? Partly yes, he was by nature simple and austere. Partly it was political theater, a conscious contrast to the distant French governors, the decadent imperial courts of the past, and corrupt local officials. He wanted to be seen as Uncle Ho, back Ho, the wise, approachable father of the nation. That image would prove incredibly powerful. But sympathy alone does not win wars. For that, there came a valley in the remote northwest near the Laotian border, a place called Dien. In 1953, tired of endless guerrilla warfare, the French High Command in Indochina, under General Henry Navarre, decided to set a trap. They would lure the Viet Minh into a major, decisive battle, where French superior firepower and air support could crush them and break the back of the rebellion. To do this, they picked a remote valley, Dien. There, they built a heavily fortified base with airstrips, artillery, and strongpoints codenamed Gabriel, Beatrice, Isabel, and so on. They assumed two things. First, that their position was virtually impregnable from ground assault, because the surrounding hills and jungles were difficult terrain for artillery. Second, that the Viet Minh, if they attacked, would be slaughtered in a frontal assault. Both assumptions were catastrophically wrong. General Vo Nguyen Giap, with Ho Chi Minh's political backing, chose to attack head-on, but not in the way the French expected. In one of the most astonishing logistical feats of the 20th century, tens of thousands of Vietnamese laborers and soldiers hauled heavy artillery, piece by piece, up muddy mountain trails, by hand and bicycle, under cover of night. They constructed camouflaged gun emplacements in the hills overlooking the French base. From those positions, they could rain shells down into the valley. French soldiers later described the shock of seeing enemy artillery fire coming not from the valley floor, but from above them, guns they had thought impossible to bring into position. The siege began in March 1954. For weeks, Viet Minh artillery pounded French positions. Infantry attacks, often by young volunteers willing to take massive casualties, stormed the outlying strongpoints. Conditions for French troops grew desperate. Supply planes were shot down or forced away by anti-aircraft fire. Medics struggled to treat the wounded in flooded trenches, and morale crumbled. Giap adjusted his tactics, sometimes halting assaults when casualties became too high, a sign of a commander learning on the job, not simply throwing lives away endlessly. All the while, Ho Chi Minh, far from the front, played his own part. He maintained political unity among his fractious coalition, extracted maximum propaganda value from each success, and kept the long-term goal in sight. Not just a battlefield victory, but international recognition of Vietnamese independence. On May 7, 1954, the French garrison at Dien Bien Phu surrendered. French soldiers marched into captivity. The tricolor came down for the last time over that isolated valley. In Paris, shockwaves rippled through the government. An army that had once prided itself on conquering half of Africa had been decisively beaten by an Asian force led by men who, only a decade earlier, had been labeled rebels and bandits. For Ho Chi Minh, it was the first empire decisively defeated. France, exhausted and humiliated, was ready to negotiate. But, as often in history, victory on the battlefield did not translate neatly into political triumph. At the Geneva conference that followed, the great powers, the Soviet Union, China, the United States, Britain, and France, all weighed in. Vietnam's fate would again be decided not just in the rice fields where its people fought, but at tables far away. The Geneva Conference of 1954 was a turning point and a compromise. On the one hand, France agreed to withdraw its forces from Indochina, effectively ending nearly a century of colonial rule. On the other hand, Vietnam was temporarily divided along the 17th parallel. The North would be under the control of Ho Chi Minh's Democratic Republic of Vietnam. The South would be under a separate regime, initially led by the former Emperor Bao Jai, and later by Prime Minister Ngo Dinh Diem, with strong support from the United States. Nationwide elections, intended to reunify the country under a single government, were scheduled for 1956. On paper, this sounded like a fair deal. In practice, it laid the groundwork for the next phase of war. American officials at the time privately admitted something telling. If free elections had actually been held, Ho Chi Minh would almost certainly have won. His popularity, especially in the countryside, was immense. But those elections never took place. The Southern government, backed by the U.S., refused to participate, citing fears of communist intimidation and fraud, and, less openly, the fear that they would just lose. Vietnam remained divided. For Ho Chi Minh and his followers, this was an incomplete victory. They had defeated one empire, France, but seen their country cut in half and a new power step into the south. The ant had kicked one elephant off its back. Now it turned to face another, much larger one, the United States of America. Before we move into that second great conflict, it's worth pausing on a question. Who was Ho Chi Minh, really, at this point? To supporters, he was a living symbol of Vietnamese resilience, a modest, principled leader who had sacrificed comfort and safety for decades to free his people. To enemies, he was a cunning, dangerous communist, a puppet of Moscow and Beijing, responsible for violent uprisings, land seizures, and political repression. The reality was complex. Ho was indeed a committed communist. He had been shaped by years in the Soviet orbit and had chosen Marxism-Leninism not as a slogan, but as a genuine framework to build a new Vietnam. Under his leadership, the North began land reform campaigns aimed at breaking the power of landlords and empowering poor peasants. These campaigns were brutal. Excesses, denunciations, wrongful executions, thousands died, especially in the early 1950s. Party records and later admissions suggest that Ho himself at times tried to moderate the violence, but he also publicly endorsed the overall policy and later apologized for errors. He could be warm and avuncular in personal dealings, yet hard, even ruthless, in political calculation. He tolerated almost no organized opposition, and yet he also refused at times to follow the more radical impulses of some within his own party. He recognized that pushing too hard, too fast, could alienate the very people in whose name the revolution was made. He was a nationalist and a communist, and he never saw those as contradictory. In Ho's mind, communism was not foreign. It was a way for Vietnam to finally break free from a world order stacked against small, poor countries. He also understood that symbols matter. He wore simple clothes, lived in a modest stilt house instead of a palace, learned to speak plainly to peasants, and cultivated a gentle, almost grandfatherly public persona. This was no accident. He knew that the struggle ahead, to reunify Vietnam, to defeat the United States, would require not just guns and bombs, but belief. Belief that the cause was just. Belief that the enemy, no matter how powerful, could be worn down. Belief that history itself was on their side. In the late 1950s, tensions between North and South Vietnam hardened. In the South, Ngo Diem's regime, backed by American aid and advisors, embarked on an anti-communist crusade. Former Viet Minh supporters were jailed, tortured, or executed. Buddhist activists, political critics, and rivals of all kinds found themselves under pressure. What had begun as a hoped-for third way, a non-communist independent Vietnam, increasingly looked like a repressive, unrepresentative government, heavily dependent on American money and military support. In the countryside, grievances multiplied. Land distribution remained unequal. Corruption festered. Many peasants nursed memories of having fought against the French under Viet Minh banners, only to be told now that they lived in a free Vietnam that did not feel very free. In the north, Ho Chi Minh and his comrades watched all this carefully. They publicly spoke the language of peaceful reunification and Geneva Accords. Privately, they prepared for another war. By 1959 to 1960, a new wave of armed resistance began in the south. Assassinations of officials, attacks on army posts, the formation of insurgent units. In 1960, these various southern-based communist and nationalist fighters were organized into the National Liberation Front, the NLF, which the Americans and the southern government would call the Viet Cong. The North denied direct control at first, portraying the struggle as a southern popular uprising. In reality, guidance, supplies, and trained cadres flowed down from the north along jungle paths through Laos and Cambodia, a labyrinthine supply network the Americans would later call the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Ironically, Ho himself did not design that trail, but his name was attached to it, a symbol of how thoroughly his personal identity had fused with the national struggle. By the early 1960s, the United States was drawn deeper and deeper into this conflict. Advisors became combat troops. Helicopters, napalm, and advanced weaponry flooded into South Vietnam. American leaders made a familiar argument. If Vietnam fell to communism, other countries in the region, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, even beyond, might follow like dominoes. They saw Vietnam not as a country with its own history and grievances, but as a square on the global chessboard against the Soviet Union and China. For Ho Chi Minh, this was confirmation of what he had always believed. Foreign empires, whatever flag they flew, were more alike than different. They would not leave until forced. So, once again, he prepared his people for a long, grinding war. By 1965, the Vietnam War, as Americans called it, was fully underway. U.S. Marines landed at Da Nang. Massive bombing campaigns, like Operation Rolling Thunder, targeted the north. American troop numbers climbed from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands. On paper, the imbalance was staggering. The United States had the world's most powerful air force, navy, and a vast industrial economy. It could rain down more explosives on this small country than had been dropped in all of World War II. North Vietnam was poor, still recovering from years of war and land reform, with limited industrial capacity and reliance on aid from China and the Soviet Union. Yet Ho Chi Minh and his comrades believed they held a different kind of strength. They were fighting on their own soil. Their supply lines were short. Their people, especially in the countryside, knew what it was to suffer and survive. Ho articulated their strategy simply, "You can kill 10 of our men for every one we kill of yours. But even at those odds, you will lose and we will win." It was not bravado. It was math, political math. He understood that the United States could win almost every battle tactically and still lose the war strategically, if its public eventually decided the price was too high. To reach that point, though, North Vietnamese and NLF forces needed to be willing to absorb enormous casualties, and they did. Villages were bombed, forests defoliated with Agent Orange, supply convoys ambushed, entire units wiped out. But the war also took a devastating toll on the South Vietnamese state. Corruption, infighting, coups, and the sense among many ordinary citizens that their government did not truly represent them sapped its strength from within. Ho Chi Minh, aging and increasingly frail, did not control every detail of military strategy. Powerful figures around him, like Le Duan, pushed for more aggressive campaigns. Yet Ho remained the moral and symbolic center. His portrait hung in meeting halls, in peasant homes, in underground bunkers. Children learned songs about Uncle Ho. His image, the patient, white-bearded elder, watched over the war like a benign ancestor. To American politicians, he was often lumped in with other communist leaders, an Asian Lenin or Vietnamese Mao. But in important ways, he was different. He did not cultivate a cult of personality to the same extreme as Stalin or Mao, though his image was undeniably central to propaganda. He did not engage in massive, showy campaigns of social engineering like the Great Leap Forward or Cultural Revolution. His focus remained, above all, on one political objective: a united, independent Vietnam. In that sense, he was less a global revolutionary and more a national liberator who happened to choose communism as his path. In January 1968, as the war ground on with no clear end in sight, North Vietnamese and NLF leaders made a daring decision. They would launch a massive, coordinated offensive across South Vietnam, timed for the Lunar New Year, Tet. The plan had multiple goals: to spark a general uprising in the South, to shatter the image of American control and security, and to deal a psychological blow that might change the course of peace negotiations. Ho Chi Minh, gravely ill by this time, was less directly involved than in earlier years. Le Duan and General Giap shaped the details, though even among them there were disagreements. When the Tet Offensive began on January 30th to 31st, 1968, it stunned the world. Hundreds of targets across South Vietnam, cities, provincial capitals, military bases, were attacked almost simultaneously by NLF and North Vietnamese units. In Saigon, fighters briefly seized parts of the U.S. Embassy compound. Intense fighting erupted in the ancient city of Hue, where some of the bloodiest urban combat of the war took place. Militarily, the offensive was extremely costly for the communists. They suffered devastating casualties. Many of their southern cadres, the political backbone of the insurgency in the South, were killed. The hoped-for general uprising among the southern population did not fully materialize in the way some planners had imagined. But politically, in the United States, the impact was enormous. Americans had been told that victory was near, that enemy forces were weakening. Then, suddenly, they saw images of heavy fighting in places that had once been described as secure. The question spread: if the enemy is supposedly on the ropes, how can they mount something like this? U.S. public opinion shifted. Confidence cracked. President Lyndon B. Johnson, who had escalated the U.S. involvement dramatically, announced soon afterwards that he would not seek re-election. Ho Chi Minh's prediction that the war would be won as much in American minds as on Vietnamese battlefields was coming true. He had outlasted one French government after another during the First Indochina War. Now, he was watching American administrations falter. He would not live to see the final act. But by the time he died, the direction of the story was already clear. On September 2nd, 1969, exactly 24 years after he had stood in Beijing Square to declare independence from France, Ho Chi Minh died in Hanoi. He was 79. The exact circumstances and timing of his death were, for a time, masked from the public. The leadership did not want the news to overshadow ongoing events or damage morale. But when it was announced, a wave of grief swept through the North. For many, it felt like losing a parent or a grandfather. Funeral processions, memorial services, and solemn gatherings filled the country. In his will, Ho had expressed a desire to be cremated, his ashes scattered over the hills and fields of Vietnam. The leadership did not follow that wish. Instead, they chose to embalm his body and place it in a monumental mausoleum in Hanoi, modeled in part on Lenin's in Moscow. In doing so, they made him not just a founder of the state, but an eternal presence, a physical symbol of continuity and legitimacy. Even in death, he was pressed into service as a political instrument. He was no longer there to disagree. Yet his absence also changed things. The men who now steered the war, Le Duan, Truong Chin, and others, were, in some ways, more hardline, less flexible, more willing to push for risky offensives. Still, Ho's overarching vision held: no compromise on reunification, no surrender of sovereignty. The war continued for nearly 6 more years. In 1972, North Vietnam and the United States reached a peace agreement in Paris that allowed for U.S. troop withdrawal. In 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon. The American-backed regime collapsed. After 3 decades of nearly continuous war, Vietnam was finally unified under one government, the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh did not live to see that moment, but it was unmistakably his victory. So, did Ho Chi Minh really defeat 3 empires? Let's look closely. The first, France, was a colonial empire already weakened by World War II and global anti-colonial movements. But it still fielded experienced troops, controlled vast territories, and had a proud military tradition. Ho and the movement he led forced France not just to negotiate, but to leave Indochina entirely after Dien, Bien Phu, and Geneva. The second, Japan, was brought down primarily by the United States, the Soviet Union, and the broader Allied war effort. Yet inside Vietnam, Ho's Viet Minh leveraged Japan's downfall to seize power faster and more effectively than any rival nationalist group, ensuring that, when the dust settled, it was his flag that flew over Hanoi. The third, the United States, was not defeated in the conventional sense. American forces were never routed in a single decisive battle like Dien Bien Phu. They withdrew as part of a negotiated settlement, but the outcome on the ground speaks for itself. The superpower that had once confidently believed it could shape the destiny of a small Asian nation instead found its political will broken, its society divided, and its armies pulled back across the Pacific. Ho Chi Minh's state survived. The American project in Vietnam did not. Measuring defeat in history is complicated. Armies can win battles and lose wars. States can sign peace treaties yet fail to achieve what they fought for. What is clear is this: 3 major powers, Imperial France, Imperial Japan, and the United States, all, at different times, claimed the right or the ability to determine Vietnam's fate. By the end of the 20th century, none of them did. Vietnam, bloodied and battered, was in Vietnamese hands. None of this means that Ho Chi Minh's legacy is simple or purely heroic. Inside Vietnam today, he is revered, his portrait in classrooms, his sayings in textbooks, his mausoleum a site of pilgrimage. The narrative emphasizes his patriotism, his simplicity, his decades of sacrifice, his leadership in both anti-French and anti-American struggles. Outside Vietnam, views are more divided. Critics point to the authoritarian nature of the regime he built, the harsh land reforms and political purges, the use of terror and assassination during the wars, the suppression of dissenting voices, including non-communist nationalists. He was a man of ideals, and a man who often chose ruthless means to achieve them. But then, that is not unusual in the 20th century. What makes him stand out is not that he was flawless, but that he was effective. He understood something that many in the capitals of empire did not: that history is not always written by the side with the most planes or largest GDP. Sometimes it is written by those who are willing to lose more, endure more, and wait longer. A French general might have scoffed at a barefoot peasant army in 1946. A Pentagon planner might have dismissed an impoverished Asian state in 1965. Ho Chi Minh did not. He believed, from his earliest days as a young kitchen helper in Paris, that the age of empires was ending, and that Vietnam, of all places, could be where that ending became undeniable. He turned his life into proof. In 1919, a young man tried to hand a petition to the President of the United States and was ignored. In 1945, that same man, under a new name, read out America's own words about freedom to declare his country independent. In 1954, his forces shattered the myth of European invincibility in a mountain valley. In the 1960s, his picture hung in hidden bunkers as American presidents agonized over a war they could not seem to win. By the time he died, the map of the world was already changing. Old colonies were becoming new nations. Empires were crumbling into history. Vietnam was no longer just a far-flung possession of some European power. It was a country that had forced the world to pay attention and had provided a script for others. How a small, poor, determined nation could outlast giants. The cost of that lesson was enormous. Millions dead, cities destroyed, generations scarred. But in the balance of power, something fundamental had shifted. Foreign rule in Vietnam had ended. The man who had started as Nguyen Sin Cung, then Nguyen Tat Thanh, then Nguyen Ai Quoc, and finally Ho Chi Minh, had spent nearly his entire adult life in pursuit of that outcome. He did not see the final flags raised, the last helicopters leave. He did not see his country rebuild, or the later economic reforms that would, ironically, embrace markets in ways early communists might have found surprising. But the line from his first petitions in Paris to the last American evacuation from Saigon is unmistakable. From kitchen fires on French ships, to jungle camps, to diplomatic conferences, to underground bunkers. His life ran alongside the great unraveling of empire in the 20th century. And at every major turn in Vietnam's story, he was there, shaping events, choosing when to compromise and when to fight, when to lay low and when to risk everything. The man who lit that fuse may not have destroyed empire everywhere, but in the land he called home, 3 empires, in turn, found their limits. Today, when visitors stand in Ba Jin Square in Hanoi, they see a large, gray mausoleum. Inside, under cooled lights, lies the body of Ho Chi Minh, guarded day and night by soldiers. Outside, students take photos. Tourists shuffle in lines. Loudspeakers sometimes play patriotic songs. It is easy, in that setting, to see only the static symbol, the marble, the ceremony, the official version of history. But if you look closer, you can still sense another story running underneath the official one. A story of a child in a poor village, watching his father lose his job for defying injustice. A teenager reading about distant revolutions in Europe and Asia. A young man washing dishes on a French steamer, listening to sailors' grievances. An activist in Paris, ignored by presidents but not discouraged. A shadowy organizer in Guangzhou and Hong Kong, writing leaflets by candlelight. An old revolutionary in a mountain cave, naming a small stream after Karl Marx and planning the overthrow of empires. History often remembers the great generals, the presidents, the kings. But sometimes the person who changes the course of an age is someone who starts in kitchens, in printing shops, in cramped rented rooms. Someone who understands not just how to resist power, but how to outlast it. If you found this story of Ho Chi Minh and the fall of 3 empires compelling, and you'd like to explore more turning points and hidden threads in world history, consider subscribing. This channel dives into the lives of people who stood at the crossroads of empires, revolutions, and great changes, and who, like Ho, left marks far larger than anyone expected. Leave a comment with which figure, event, or era you'd like to see next. Another revolutionary, a forgotten dynasty, a war that changed everything but is barely remembered. History is full of stories like this. We've only just begun to tell them.